we'll get started. I'm me and Nigel, and what I'll do is I'll get you to go around, just push the button. If it glows green, it's working, and I'll just get you to introduce yourselves, which community board you're from, just for anyone that's watching, just so they know who's in the room. So, pass to my right.
I'm Nicola Nimmo from the Temuka Community Board.
I'm Gay Broker from Temuka Community Board.
Charles Scarsbrook, Temuka Community Board.
Raywin Hessel, Pleasant Point Community Board.
Rosie Woods from Geraldine Community Board.
Shane Minier from the Geraldine Community Board.
Jan Finlayson from Geraldine, and apologies from Wayne as well, I'm sorry, and Janine Adams today.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think most of you, or some of you at least, will know Malcolm because he's done some induction training. I think you would have, those that were part of that. But I'll pass you on to Malcolm, who's going to take us through the representation review.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good early evening, whichever it is. Yes, my name is Malcolm Alexander. I'm currently assisting Council with their representation review. I'm a partner in an advisory firm, Bill Alexander, and prior to this gig, I was the former Chief Executive of Local Government New Zealand. Okay. We have a set of slides here which I will run you through. There has been an earlier workshop with the Mayor and councillors on this, but this was sort of, I'll do two things today. First of all, run through the nature of what a review is and the decision points that Council will ultimately have to resolve. Obviously this is a workshop and that was a workshop, so no decisions have been taken or can be taken at a workshop. This is about airing the nature of the decisions to be made and the various choices really that are on the table. So no decisions have been made. This is sort of, in some respects, can be viewed as the first part of the preliminary consultation prior to the other consultations. So I'll talk you through these slides, but please interrupt with questions or clarification as we go, and happy to take questions. Well, there's the general aspect to deal with, that is the nature of representation in the district as a whole, wards, councillor numbers, all that sort of thing. There's also an aspect around community boards itself, so particularly interested in your feedback on those matters. So, the first thing, so way of divide is, why do we actually have a representation? Why is this happening now? I'll recap the nature of the discussion that we've just had, just to give you that greater feedback about the nature of the pros and cons of various options. That will include the tasks that officers have been given to go away and do further work to advise elected members. Then we'll deal with the community boards as well, and then I'll talk you through briefly the consultation, appeals, objection process, and council process from here. So first, why is a representation review required? Now, it's a provision of the Local Electoral Act 2001 that a periodic reviews of the nature of representation within a district occur, and it must occur at least once every 6 years, and Timaru is now due. Okay, the last review was 2017, so now we're in 2023. So the decisions made in terms of the review here will appear at the 2025 local body elections. The decision is for council, the elected members of council, subject to any appeal or objection rights. So ultimately the decision is for them, having taken on board what they consider valid views of the community, but they make a call and that's the model that goes forward, subject to any appeal rulings from the Local Government Commission. So the key decisions to be made in this review are on the board there now. So I can summarise them as follows. Should we have a wards system, or what we call at large? That is where councillors are elected by everybody in the district, and there's no ward or geographic differentiation. Mixture. You can have a mixture. There's a decision around the number of councillors that are to be elected in a district, and that ranges from, I'll get to it, but if memory serves, it's between 5 and 29, so there's quite a large number. If council chooses to go down the ward model or keep the ward model going, what are the names of those wards, what are the boundaries, and so on and so forth, and there are rules around that. If you go ward, how many councillors per ward be elected relative to the overall number of wards? And the thing with a particular focus on you is these sort of the obligation to have a representation review for that type of thing also applies to community boards. So the decisions and I'll get to that, but whether there should be any community boards, if so, how many, what should they, that sort of thing. So it's a legal requirement that council must discharge. Okay. Now, in terms of as I call this a recap of matters covered, so it is all up here because we've literally just finished. Let me talk you through that. So we have to determine, and they have to determine by resolution, which is a formal council decision. They've got to determine those points around, firstly, whether or not to have wards or not, and if so, the nature of those wards or at large. When doing so, there are a number of rules that must be applied. And the first one is whatever model or set of arrangements council wishes to put in place, they must ensure that it provides, quote, effective representation of communities of interest. Okay, so that is a formal test, and we'll talk about what that means later. Ward boundaries have to coincide with the boundaries of what are known as statistical mesh blocks. Now, a statistical mesh block is a formal term, it's in the Act, but it's what the Department of Statistics, or Ministry, whatever they are these days, do to do the census. Okay, so within, I think Tash said we've got about 150 odd mesh blocks in Timaru, roughly? Oh, 500, I'm way out. And if you look on the map just behind Tash, which we'll come to later, you'll see those little lines all over the place, so they're dividing the mesh blocks. And we can drill down by mesh block into whether there's 20 people, so on and so forth. Now, the reason for that is we have to know where everyone is, and to ensure that there's fair representation as well as effective representation, we have to work that out. Now, right now, we're working on the basis of 2018 census data. Which has been extrapolated out by the Local Government Commission to 2022, but we just had a census, and the complicating factor with that is we won't get the first results of that until May next year, okay? Unless we can talk them into, say, Timaru might be ready to go. So one of the problems with the census since over the last couple of census is that turnout has not been as good as it should be, and that leaves gaps in the data which has to be statistically filled by extrapolation, and that's what generally takes. Now, there's all sorts of methodologies to do that, but they have to fill that out. And we're led to believe that the rate of response wasn't as good even as last time, but it is what it is. So we're having to deal with that at the same time, and so we need those mesh blocks, and we'll talk you through why that's important shortly. As far as practical, if council chooses to go down the ward approach again, the boundaries may also try to coincide with what either a local board area, which doesn't apply here, or community boundaries, community board boundaries. So we try to get an assessment there, but that is a nice to have in some respects. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to have to shoot through this. Now, as I say, I've talked about the communities of interest must be achieved within a 5 to 29 elected members, excluding the mayor. The mayor is elected at large. Right now, there are 9 councillors. So the decision for council is, do we stick with 9? Do we go up? Do we go down? And that's going to be impacted by what is known as the plus or minus 10% rule, which I'll get to in a minute. But those are the decisions at play. More councillors, there's pros and cons of that, and we can talk about that when we get to it. In terms of the ward at large issue, generally the LGC's, the Local Government Commission's guidance is that councils that select an at large approach, and Dunedin is an example of a council that doesn't have wards, unless they've changed that with any current representation review. Generally, the district is going to be compact, by and large, so there's generally a one community of interest rather than different communities of interest, and they're spread and not geographically distinct. So counterpoint that with Timaru at the moment, you've got a large district, and we'll come to communities of interest, but you could argue there's the Timaru urban, there's Temuka, Pleasant Point, Geraldine in particular, which is not unusual at a provincial level where you have large areas but conurbations of people in a particular area, rather than being broadly smooth across the whole district, if you get the difference. If they do go wards, they've also got to consider the merits of one councillor award or more than one councillor award. So I'll go through the rules, and then I'll talk about the nature of the discussion. There is a thing known as the plus or minus 10% rule. Are you familiar with that rule? Yeah, some of you are. Yeah, that's to ensure fair representation as well as effective. Oh, have you? Oh, yeah, I'll still talk to it anyway. I've got to make sure the process is important. That is an important rule because right now, based on the provisional numbers out of the 27, that was it last time, and you can see Geraldine was at 9.52 last time. So you came within the 10% rule for the Geraldine ward, but even in the Pleasant Point Temuka, you're on the other side, but at 8.6. So you're right up against it. Based on current numbers, Geraldine breaches the plus or minus 10% rule. In other words, at 15.47, Geraldine's underrepresented. Okay. Pleasant Point Temuka is about the same, but it's still, within cooey of the 10% rule. So what that means is, irrespective of anything else, if we were to keep the wards system, if we were to keep the number of councillors, there will have to be a change to the boundaries to accommodate the 10%. The complicating factor is that's on the basis of the number of elected members that you see there. So there's currently one for Geraldine, currently two, so on. If council ultimately chooses to alter the number of elected members per area, per ward, if they keep a ward system, then that complicates we'll have to rerun the numbers and work out how it is once we know what the census data is telling us. There's a number of ways of doing that. For example, if we whatever calculation we use, we move it in for the sake of argument, and this is just for the sake of argument to illustrate the point. If we moved it so that Geraldine was within 7%, say the argument, there's probably enough fat in the system that it doesn't matter what the census data comes along with, because you'll be probably fat. If we move it to 9.5 and the census data comes along and says, hold on, you're now over. So that's why that coming in the middle of it is important. So does that all make sense? Wards, plus or minus 10%, number of councillors is the sort of discussion points that councillors will have to. Now, the nature of the discussion held to date was asking, we got the to's and froms from elected members, and they have asked for officers to do more work on scenarios, essentially, okay? And I will get Tash to talk through some of those in a minute. She's sitting there ready to go with her mesh block scenarios. But the sort of material, just to give you a sense of what we will be exploring so that elected members will consider this more formally, will have options in front of them about how they want to play. So right now, they're looking to be informed about different people's perspectives, and as community board members, you're likely to have a perspective not only on the ward and councillor issue, but also the community board issue as well, which I'll come to in due course. So in terms of the discussion I had, bearing it was a discussion, not a decision-making thing, so they were shooting the breeze in some respects, where we've been asked to look at, is there other options for having to think about wards? Maybe there's for example, rather than a place-based split. Some councils do use that, where they have particularly a large central urban area. I think Hastings is a good example, the town of Hastings, but then there's a rural slot around it, so you can divide it that way. So we're going to have a look to see how that rolls. We are looking to see whether from a community of interest point of view, bearing in mind that's the test we have to do, is Pleasant Point a community of interest separate from the Temuka one? Do the numbers stack up for that? Does that justify a rethinking of wards as a consequence? In terms of and how that plays out, though there was probably a sense that all things being equal, the 3 may be the way to go, subject to doing that further work to see whether or not there are other more effective options that could be brought to bear. In terms of the number of elected members, we have been asked to look at what would be the impact of increasing councillor numbers by 1 or reducing by 1, either way, because that then impacts on the how many people per councillor you have on the 10% rule. So that'll run a number of scenarios to sort of work that out. Now, that may mean, just for the sake of argument, for example, Geraldine could arguably go to 2 elected members. The question will be, and that'll help their number, the question is what is the consequence for the other wards as a result of that? So there's a shifting around, and we're just going to have to run the numbers on that to see how that goes, and then those options will be presented to council to see. But that was those were in terms of the thrust of the discussion. Hopefully I've reflected that well. That's the sort of nature of debate. So interested on whether you guys have any particular thoughts or questions on the ward at large approach, the number of councillors, any particular. You don't have to. We're just interested in your feedback. Or we could go right now and then come back to that. Tash has run scenarios for the councillors about what it might mean to boundaries if you kept the same number of wards and the same number of elected members, bearing in mind we've got a 15.47 issue we have to correct. So I'm in your hands really, if you want to have a general discussion now, or would you like to see what those permutations look like? Want to see the permutations? Now, please, I emphasise, this is thinking out loud about how it might go, depending on the mesh blocks, because we have to move enough people around to drop within that 10% figure. So Tasha's been playing with that.
With the Pleasant Point ward and with the Pleasant Point, Temuka and Geraldine ward, you've got councillors associated to those areas. With the Timaru district, broken down into those blocks, does each different councillor have a different area within Timaru they're responsible for?
No. So the 6 councillors for the Timaru ward, the mesh blocks are simply statistical building blocks to ensure that we're counting the number of people per ward in a way that is fair across everybody. So remember, our goal is fair representation. In other words, that Timaru doesn't get a better crack of the whip than Geraldine. So we're trying to get that equality. The plus or 10% rule is designed to put a bit of flex in the system, so you can, within that sort of 0, you can go either side, and that's considered fair. Going outside is basically considered not fair. You can get an exemption if you and if the council went outside the 10% rule, it becomes a sort of a de facto appeal immediately to the Local Government Commission. Because
my point really is the fact that Timaru, if you look at population base, if you've got a more effective in the other areas, there's only 2 and 1 councillors. In Timaru, there's 6. So if you've got one councillor that's more effective than the others, people will go to them first. They could be overburdened with work.
Yeah, the Act is completely blind to that. This is not about how a councillor does or does not do its job. It is simply about how do we ensure effective representation. I would argue that the judgment of whether a councillor has been an effective representative or not is determined every 3 years.
Malcolm, the ratio at the moment of 9 elected members, something like 5,300, is that about right? I mean, what's the ideal ratio for members?
There is no ideal. It's there are differences across the country. I always argue that it's a subjective nature because there are competing considerations. Some people value a lot more councillors because they think that is that it helps with representation, but it also means the remuneration pool is divided a lot. So that potentially can impact on people who wish to stand because there's a bit of time there. Others feel smaller number of councillors deliver a greater effective reputation because they're more focused on things. So there's no right answer to that question. Hence, the review is about seeing what the community wants or is happy with. Council is required to have a view, and I'll come to how that works in a minute. But ultimately, the judgment is for it, subject to the views of the community and subject to any appeal rights. So there's no right answer to that in my view.
So just a little bit more on that. So the discussion could go around the fact that whether the average for the whole region is what we'd call correct or what we feel is correct, given that there's no formal guidelines to that, or so we assess it on the whole or we break it down into the individual wards. Because if you assess it on the whole, then I assume we're just deciding, or the council is deciding if that's about right. If it's breaking down per ward, then you're, as Charles pointed a little bit, taking from one, giving to the other, which starts shifting representation.
I suppose my answer to that would be yes and no. Okay, that sounds a typical lawyer answer, doesn't it? But anyway, what I mean is that yes, you can do that, but you're always subject to the requirement for effective and fair representation within the plus or minus 10%. So these are permutations, but you're not allowed to depart from those overriding criteria. With the exception of the 3 exceptions on the 10% rule, which in my view won't apply. So that's always going to apply to whatever the numbers are. So the judgment is what is the most effective number, what's going to give them the best bang for the bucks. The 10% rule wouldn't even be a consideration if you went for at large, for example, because then the issue with that is then, you know, if you kept 9 councillors and they all went at large and everyone in Timaru got elected and no one else, then you have arguably non-effective representation because districts. So that's why that's a crucial decision. So really, if you go the wards to ensure that each geographic area has some form of representation within those criteria, that's you just play around with what is considered to be an appropriate number of elected members for the size of the district, relative to the population base, which, by the way, is a dynamic thing because the councillors let me know that there has been good demographic growth, I think in Geraldine in particular, but at the end of the day, the review is a snapshot in time, okay? So you'll make a point in time and this is what it is, which is why there's always an inbuilt obligation to review it at least once every 6 years. Was that a... Yep. Tash, and she can sort of take you through what that might mean. Remember, again, I emphasise because this has been live streamed and I want people to understand that these are just scenarios, this is not the decision, and it assumes that the number of elected members stay the same and that the current ward system stays the same, which may or may not prove to be the case. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name's Taj Port. I'm the GIS analyst here, one of them here at TDC. I was given the task of, with Malcolm, there was 3 of us shut in a room to come up with some scenarios to start this conversation. Just also reiterating what Malcolm said too, remember this is from the 2018 data, census data. We still don't have the 2023 as of yet, but we're hoping that coming closer to the time that we'll be able to get a snapshot at least what that will look like, where the information may change and, you know, change the decision, etc., etc. So you'll see in front of you all 3 options. There's 4 including the current, so it gives you the current ward system the way it is at the moment. So you'll have 2 sheets of each of the option 1 through to 3. The emphasis on these we were looking at more the Temuka and Pleasant Point ward boundaries and the Geraldine boundaries with the data, as you can see. I've also got on the bottom of them the additional tentative was what it could look like total for the Pleasant Point and Temuka ward. So the emphasis around this, the first one will show you what the new boundary could possibly look like, and the one with the dark blue in between the Geraldine and the Temuka Pleasant Point and boundaries is basically where the changes will reside from Geraldine to Pleasant Point. And again, just remember that these are just options to get the conversation really started. So as you can see in that first one, option 1, if I get these layers going up here for you, you'll see. Okay, so in option 1, if I zoom this in a wee bit, So we haven't touched Timaru for these at this point, but as we say, and the concern of this part was for Geraldine, Pleasant Point and Temuka. So in here you will see, hang on, I don't know why I highlighted that, excuse me. You'll see, because I've zoomed that in, the numbers in each of those wee mesh blocks is the approximate total within the 2018 census. So that's the current population. So we looked at Orari, you know, changing that depending on when, you know, Orari could think themselves as Geraldine population. But this, again, this is just a conversation, this, you know, just to keep this going. So yeah, we looked at that. So we thought about, with all these mesh blocks, as you'll see that some of them are bigger than others. So some people will kind of think, well, that's a bigger mesh block, so there's probably more numbers. That's not exactly the case. As you know, it's rural. So the population, you may only have half a dozen in there and it's more farmland. So just wanted to emphasise that too. And just also too that these mesh blocks, as you can see, the black and white line through it is state and estate highway. Mesh blocks don't go through, mesh blocks can go through highways, so a half a mesh block. To try and get, we had the question about, could we do a mesh block with the population up to the highway? So you can split it up through the highway, which could possibly make sense. Unfortunately, the answer is no, because not all of them, some mesh blocks actually cross over some highways. So then, you know, it's the same with why we couldn't do it within parcel boundaries and stuff, because parcel boundaries can also go over mesh blocks.
So that mesh block Tash that has 18 in it, just below 75,
Yep.
that's an example of it cutting across the
Yep.
state highway there.
So that's the state highway, so if I turn that off, as you can see, it's come right through. So that's, and it's the same with your parcel boundaries for properties as well. So there's quite a few properties within there. And then you get like, especially with the likes of Timaru and Temuka, as you can see this wee mesh block for 21, there's a lot of those. So the population in Timaru is quite huge, but you can have a wee mesh block like that. So for example, if we went to like Christchurch or even Auckland, one little building or one little block could have anywhere from 1,000 people, depending on how many people live in those apartments. So that's, you know, trying to do that in that area. So that's just to give you some context.
Is there a desire to have them broken, or to have the boundary sitting on State Highway? I mean, what's the desire for that? Is that just tidiness in the map, or is there some other reason, rather than cutting through a mesh block?
No, I don't know. It's probably above my pay grade, unfortunately. That was done before I don't know why they did it within the mesh block. I think the highways were just there. I think the mesh block of the population is just the way it was, unfortunately. That's probably a government question. Sorry. If I had the answer, I'd love to give it to you, but I don't know. Sorry, yeah.
There's a natural tidiness about it. If you went,
Yeah.
they completely ignore that stuff.
Yeah.
We are forced, because the Act requires us to deal with mesh blocks, irrespective of whether they make sense on the map or not. Yeah.
Yeah, but for this purpose, so we tried to keep it as tidy, and we thought, well, these three options, like I said, are around Orari a wee bit, and as you can see also through Geraldine, the Geraldine and Temuka in that boundary. So as you see with the numbers there, that is the tentative change that could happen with option one. And as you see within your map, option one took into context the whole of within the Orari Township. I know that there's some properties that are around that blue line, but it was just in the consideration for that. And that also gave us a total, as you'll see on the map, of the residential population for that. The change total would be 585. That would be taken away from Geraldine, but putting in to the Temuka Pleasant Point ward boundary.
Move Pleasant Point closer to zero, which is and it would bring Geraldine down under the 10% roll. But that's just an example. The elected members did debate that, you know, obviously we played around with it. So one of the questions that came up, for example, around Orari, what's the community of interest? Okay, is it Temuka or is it Geraldine? Because community of interest is part of the criteria, and how do you think about that? Rangitata, the Rangitata huts came up as well, just to go see it. Does that sit well currently in Geraldine, but is that more of a community? And does that make sense to move it over? Those are the sort of debates. So everything feeds off one another. So you have to balance all those things in the round and then make a call.
Now, I don't know if it's the right time to raise this now, but I would say that the Orari community of interest is definitely attached to Geraldine supermarkets, schools and so on. And just this year we've rubber stamped a plan that was a long time in the making that actually includes, so a strategic framework for our community that includes Orari. As far as Rangitata goes, you know, if you look at the top of the map, the confluence of the Clyde and the Havelock and the Lawrence, which is where the Rangitata actually starts, you know, it's our patch all the way down. And there's a certain coherence which I think is useful in having that. I know that those people certainly use our schools, and we see them in our supermarkets. DOC has even published a Rakitata, that's using the Ngāi Tahu expression, Rakitata River Revival Strategy recently too. So I think there are some strong arguments there for keeping it with Geraldine, but you know, I'd like to hear some counter-arguments too.
Can I just ask a question as well? Is there any evidence or that shifting wards or boundary lines can change property values?
Not aware of that, but it's a point we can look into, but I'm personally not aware of that. I've heard of that before, but I equally can't say that it's not true, but I'm not aware of that, but we can have a look at it. Maybe if it was a case, it's probably more of a metro issue in the sense that, and I know this with Wellington amalgamation, where the line between Wellington City and Pororua was a factor about that sort of thing, but may or may not be that big a factor here. But I honestly don't know the answer to that, but we can have a look into that. Yep.
Sorry. Apologies, Jen. Answered your question in regard to the Rangitata Rakitata. Scott presented the counter just in regard to the hut community at the bottom, that their community of interest was probably more Temuka, but that was the only comment, I think, that came back. Apologies, I have to leave, but just to leave you with a comment, and you'll get through to the community boards. But the general discussion from the councillors as far as future of those was, although there was good discussion, it was that they added value, and we were of the view that they should certainly stay. But you can have a counter to that if you so wish. But I'll leave you for that.
One other interesting point would be the ECAN boundaries, because I know for the Temuka Community Vehicle Trust, we service Rangitata huts area within our plan and our funding through ECAN. So have you got those layered over the top of any of these anywhere? The ECAN boundary for the community vehicle trusts.
And the regional council boundary, as far as I'm aware, is not a relevant consideration for the purposes of determining how representation within the territorial authority grows.
My only point related to that is the fact that the Temuka Community Vehicle services the Rangitata community for that purpose, so they do have a bit of an association.
It goes back a long time to when the intercity buses stopped coming through, and we've got quite a population of elderly folk and people who need to have transport, and so ECAN stumped up, and we were the first community in Geraldine to get it, and Temuka's got one too, and it probably is a bit relevant. Yeah.
The purposes of the statute, not, but for a broader understanding of how community interests might evolve, we can...
I think it's community of interest, probably.
Yeah, probably right. I may draw the discussion out a bit. So I've heard that Orari, at least in the view of some around the table, made the community of interest towards Geraldine, Rangitata huts as well. Where then, if we're confronted with the same number of elected members and the numbers, as you see on the board behind you in the 15, where then would be, in your view, an appropriate place to alter the boundary? I'm not holding you to this, but I'm looking for your upfront sense, because on this model, again, on this model only, that boundary will have to alter, otherwise we're outside the rules.
Yeah, we've heard about the huts, and I think it's a good argument. Maybe the huts come out, but I do think it's appropriate that that main part of the, towards the mouth of the river remain with Geraldine. One bit that we haven't talked about is that that bit that runs pretty much parallel to Highway 79, just south of the highway. I think that those families send their children to Geraldine schools rather than Mackenzie College. So I don't,
Are those the 3 mesh blocks under that state highway from Geraldine out to Fairley?
and if you head out to the west from that, yeah, those ones there, yeah.
That's
Yeah,
they are in the move as well, based on that scenario anyway.
yep.
That in itself, Tash, correct me if I'm wrong, is probably not enough people. Yeah.
No. It's just if they were sending their children to Fairley schools, I think that would make them a bit more neutral, but to my understanding, they come to Geraldine.
Critical to the assessment. Okay. Any other comments? I mean, this is just one, unless Tash, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So Mayor Nigel did state that Scott Shannon had said that the public of interest for Rangitata Huts was definitely aligned with Temuka, didn't he? Did I hear that right? Yeah.
At the council debate, there was discussion that mesh block there you see at 123 down to the huts, that there was an argument that it did align to Temuka, which is why that was appropriate. But that was only a preliminary view, by the way. But because of the numbers, a big debate was around Orari, because we're 5.5% out. So this is not a small, we're not dealing with a dozen people here. We need to move about 500 odd from memory. Again, to emphasise, assuming the same ward system, assuming the same number of elected members, which may alter.
So what might help our discussion is what was the work that the councillors have asked the staff to do, like just so we have an understanding of the questions that they raised.
Sure.
And what were they looking for in responses?
Again, I think it's fair to say they need to meet their statutory obligation, which is a fair and effective representation of communities of interest. So that's the test. So what we're going to run with is a number of scenarios, i.e. the differing nature of wards. If they choose to accept a ward thing, that may be the 3, or it may be adding a 4th ward for the sake of argument, or it may be a different approach, urban-rural, that came up. So we will play with those to see, one, do they meet the test of communities of interest? My immediate reaction on the rural-urban one is because there are different urban areas within the Timaru district, that may not work. But unless you take Timaru as the Timaru city itself is different to the rest, so we need to look at that. Within then the ward system, we're looking at where those various mesh blocks, how they may play out relative to the communities of interest, and there may be choices around that. And then the other aspect is one way around this issue in order to meet our 10% rule is, do we look at the number of elected members? Okay, so right now Geraldine has 1. I haven't run the numbers, but if they went to 2, which would, all things being equal, increase the number of elected members from 9 to 10, or the number of councillors from 9 to 10, would that be the right way to go? And they're agnostic about that. They just want to see how those numbers run. The question was, well, will that impact the decision-making around the table? The answer is no, because you'll have an odd number with the mayor at 11. But right now we have an even number, but the mayor has a casting vote. So that's not an issue. So, Councillor? Yeah.
Sorry, Malcolm, if I may, I think the discussion was actually around reducing the number of councillors rather than increasing them. So then Geraldine had 1 and would have been well within the 10%.
Yes, from your perspective, Councillor. Another councillor looked at the +1 as well.
Okay. Because I just don't see how it will work with +1 on the numbers.
You may be right, but we're going to run both numbers, yep.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but these 3 options are showing removal of mesh blocks from the Geraldine ward. Has any consideration been made to grow the Geraldine ward and shift that to 2 councillors and take it from another ward?
Not as yet, because that scenario was done on the existing number of elected members. But if you increase the members or move the number of members around, as Councillor just said, you reduce by 1 and move them around, that could happen. But we haven't done that work yet. So this was just a first cut, just to give a sense that if you meet the to meet the 15, what this would entail. So we made the key point of saying this assumes the same number of elected members per ward. That could alter, as Councillor Pies just mentioned. Yep.
So just to clarify my point, and maybe I've misunderstood what you've just said, but growing the Geraldine ward, the elected member numbers remain the same, but it's just shifting.
No, well, my view is that if you're to grow the Geraldine ward without changing the number of elected members for that ward, well then that might, because I haven't done the numbers in the division, but that might correct the problem potentially. But is that then correct? The question then for the elected members is, are we happy to go from 9 to 10? Or are we saying if we grow Geraldine by 1, we're reducing probably Timaru, maybe Pleasant Point by 1, you see, if they want to stay at 9. So there's a number of scenarios that the elected members will have to consider how they roll. And as Councillor just said, there was a discussion about reducing numbers, but equally another councillor had a view, because I've made a note of it, they wanted to look at increasing the numbers. I have made the point to the councillors that remuneration is done on a pool basis, so if you increase the numbers, you are you're affecting remuneration as well, which, when it's a job for which people should be remunerated. So those are all considerations that come into play. Yeah. But bear in mind, whatever happens, and again, I'm doing this mainly for the streaming audience, we must meet the test of effective and fair representation according to communities of interest. So we're going to, whatever we do, we have to overlay that and say, have we ticked those boxes? If we haven't, that's not a viable scenario.
Sure, I'm just getting engrossed in this conversation, actually.
The answers for you, but we're at the start of the process. It'll all come out in the wash, trust me.
Again, too, also just keep in mind also that this is 2018 census data. Things have obviously changed a lot, and we still haven't had the 2023 data yet. So yeah, I've put up on the screen, as you can see, option 2, which shows this time that Orari is part of the Geraldine ward. So I've just zoomed that up on the screen. So it's all included, where I took most of it, put it into Temuka and Pleasant Point, sorry. So yeah, and the numbers are, as you can see, the number of the wards or the population that are there, which brings us down to a total of 396 that would increase the Temuka and Pleasant Point ward by. And it just means that that little lip across from the state highway is still included, which is this little dude here, which I think that holds only 21 people through that little block there. The third option, which had a change of 417, again, like we say, we revolved this around just Orari. This was just in the discussion, because we did play around with the number 45 and the 60 total, even the 39, to see if we could, in this scenario, if we can decrease or somehow bring them through. And unfortunately, with the less population and the bigger mesh blocks, the numbers either brought it way too far down or didn't bring it to the way the council is in the moment. So with our third one, this might freak you out a little bit, but we just put the scenario in of basically dividing Orari. That was Orari, that was option 2. Where have I got option 3? There we go. Dividing Orari through the highway, basically. So I know that on out the Temuka side of it, there's not so many, the population through there, the more rural houses and stuff there. I wasn't too sure. It was just something just to try and just to see where it was. Also brought it up to the discussion that we had that, again, the highway, rather than just to keep it tidy, this was just the option to display that, really. So the difference of, keeping it right down the middle and just, as you say, tidying it up through that mesh block to make it look quite nice. But again, it also comes down to the community of Orari. And as growing up in Temuka and that, I'm aware that they obviously think of themselves as Geraldine, part of Geraldine, rightfully so. I've always thought of them that way. living in Temuka and stuff. But yes, so that was just the third option there. And again, you could see the total of 417.
So I've just got a thought then. Is there, just bear with, because it's a couple of components to my comment. I'm not sure it's even going to be a question. Has consideration been given to shifting populations? So regionally, are we growing overall, or are we, and I'm aware that the 2022-23 census info is not available, I understand, but you alluded, Malcolm, just before that the numbers may have grown in some areas. Is there any overlays that can show a shifting numbers of population from A to B to C, etc., which would then drive where the representation should be?
Yeah, good question. Couple of points. First of all, the data that we've received from the Local Government Commission, who've extrapolated for 2022 from the 2018 census base, so that's their extrapolation which they've sent to us, so they're telling us we're on notice that we have to deal with 10%. That suggests there's been a growth of population, okay? One of the councillors, was it your colleague from Geraldine, councillor, I can't remember. Yeah, it's indicated strongly that there had been strong population growth in that area, and that might likely to continue, at least in his view. I made the point, which is fair enough, I made the point that the representation view is a snapshot in time, okay? So based on the, you do it, and you just have to do at that point in time. If Geraldine area continues to grow, you'll have to relook at that again at the next representation review, which can be less than 6 years if you feel that, if elected members feel that there's been a sufficient change in demographics, so that justifies looking at it again. But in any event, must be within 6 years. Okay, so at the latest it would be 2029. So, but yes, the growth comes into it, but it'll be a snapshot in time. Which is why we're a bit leery of this census data, because that's an extrapolation and the census data will presumably be accurate, touch wood, and then we'll know where we are. But so that'll impact, frankly, based on that data from the, and as I say, the LGC, the Commission, by sending us this data, is telling us we're on notice that we have an issue to deal with on the 10% rule. Yeah. But look, it looks like growth is occurring, yes.
Yeah, thanks, Tash. Yeah, I like the thought of Orari like Pakoon, you know. Hey, just a question, going back to what we were talking about before with respect to the rangatata huts. I take what you said about your mesh blocks. Is it possible, though, to carve the huts area out and leave that other one, can't see the number, that runs along the south bank of the Rangitata River, to leave that bit in Geraldine and carve out the huts and have that go to Temuka Pleasant Point?
Let me see if I understand your question well. You mean divide that mesh block and allocate a portion to Temuka and a portion to Geraldine? I don't believe, I'd check that, but I don't believe so, because the whole mesh block has to be incorporated, as I understand it. I'll need to check that, but I think the answer is no. But it's a fair point worth, I'll verify that. Yep. Because
I would argue that, you know, the farming area outside of the huts spot is very Geraldine focused. And I know a lot of those families send their kids to Geraldine schools plus Karoo Peel Forest School, whose children tend to go on then to Geraldine High.
Sorry to interrupt there. Were you meaning just the huts themselves? Yeah, because the huts themselves at the moment are part of, as you can see, that mesh block. They're a mesh block of their own.
Sorry, yes, I see what you mean.
Yeah. So they're a mesh block of their own, right there. So if I can check out the attribute of that.
So you're talking about in the existing Temuka thing, not that
No, I think
triangle.
she's talking about, we're in our current one, the Rangitata Islands one is already still part of our current Geraldine zone. And she was, I think you were wondering whether that was part of the Geraldine as well?
But it is already carved out. Yes, I see. That solved that question for me. Thank you.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Councillor?
Sorry, can I just ask a question about the hut people, sorry, that's not a very good term, that's not what I meant, but how do we count them? Because they're not actually ratepayers, they're not actually permanent residents there, and so how do they actually get to be a large group of people in a mesh block?
It comes directly from census data. People have responded accordingly. That's how we take it from. We're governed by the census. So if the census is telling us there's, I can't see the number, 47 people there, then we treat it as 47 people. We don't look behind that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. Councillor Pye, my understanding is it is census night and where they say that they are at that time, and then, as Malcolm said, it's a snapshot in time.
If you think that through, there has to be a snapshot in time because of how otherwise you're changing it every day as people move around. So, which is why the statute has an inbuilt review mechanism into it to ensure that it's up to date. Yeah.
And just for your curiosity, 2018 there was 30 residents there. So that's probably growing as well. Yeah, probably growing a bit too.
I don't think you can split a mesh block, but I'll do a double confirmation. Though having said that, with that discussion, it may be a moot point anyway. Yeah. So that just gives you a sense of the issues we have to grapple with because of the 10% rule, which is a good rule, by the way. It's not a problem. It's designed to achieve proper democratic representation. B.
Yeah, I think you're correct, Malcolm, because stat says that the mesh block is the lowest level building blocked by, and it does define electorates and polling areas. So that is my understanding, is that it's not possible to split a mesh block.
That's my view. I've never heard of that before, but that's why I can't definitively answer. But I'm pretty sure that that's the case. Yeah. Be a formal consultation period. We're in essentially what I call the pre-consultation period before we formally kick the process off with an interim proposal, which I'll come to later on. How are we going for time? We need to get to your particular subject matter very shortly, so I'll move things along. So just to summarise for you, the decisions, and again, you can reflect on this. You're not looking for answers necessarily now unless you've got a viewpoint you want to share. Will Timaru retain a ward-only system or move to at-large as one of the first decisions, or combination? If we're going to retain wards, what are they? The names, the boundaries, do we keep the same names and the same boundaries? If the present ward approach is continued, we then have to apply the 10% rule to ensure, relative to communities of interest, and you can see the various permutations. That also encompasses, in order to work out the 10% rule, the number of elected members, both overall and per ward, and that could go up, or as Councillor has indicated, that could go up or down. And the Councillor's correct, the predominant discussion was down, but there was one councillor who wanted to get this, is there a case to go up? And so that's the nature of the decision that the councillors have to make. It is a councillor decision, I must emphasise. That's part of their job and their requirement in the statute. Ultimately, they have to present the community with a view. Okay.
Should we now have a bit of a discussion around if we want at-large, or what the thoughts are about at-large or wards?
Sure. If you've got views, I'm happy to hear them. That's one of the reasons.
My view on that, I think, is we need the wards because we need to have that representation because of geographical area that we've got and the different communities that are represented. The ward system needs to stay as it is with the three different Temuka, Pleasant Point, Geraldine and Timaru.
A view that others tend to share or have a different point of view?
I tend to, yes, but, you know, we do have to look at the other thing. We've got to look at large because it does have benefits, and I think we've consistently not looked at them. So at the moment, well, no, if you have an at-large system, every councillor is committed to the welfare of everything. Whereas, you know, when you've got wards, Yeah, I know when it comes to decision-making, and every councillor needs to be boned up, but actually that, firm committed responsibility for that ward rests with one or two people who have their own interests and capacities and capabilities. So it doesn't necessarily work out fairly, and it's just, I do prefer a ward system in the end, but I do think we need to give the at-large system a good deal of scrutiny and thought.
Thank you, Councillor. Again, it's blind to particular effectiveness of councils. This is simply about effective representation. The community chooses or makes judgments on the quality of how councillors discharge their function every 3 years.
There's a principle under what I was saying. I wasn't referring to any particular people, but there is a principle at large there where, you're bringing in everybody's full attention. They're completely obliged to do that in an at-large system, where there's less of such an obligation, I think, under a ward system.
I hear you, and that's one of the judgment calls that have to be made. And the Commission, the Local Government Commission, gives guidance on that. And where you have a more smaller area where there's less distinction, there can be a strong argument for that. The argument gets weaker, but it's not beyond argument that as you get a larger district with distinct areas, that the argumentation at large gets a bit weaker. The reason for that is if you have an at large, and based on Timaru's size, there is a potential scenario where everyone can get elected for the whole district from Timaru. That's what at large can result in. And then the question is, were that scenario to happen, would that be, first of all, leaving aside the community of interest point of view, would that lead to effective and fair representation? Now, you're quite right, councillors have to take an oath of office to make decisions in favour of the whole district. So, yes, so the ward system is simply about ensuring that each distinct community of interest has a view at the table, primarily.
The other thing that I've raised, when any time this has come up, because I don't think that we've done it due diligence, is that in an at-large system, every person who is affected by the decision-making of the whole council gets a say in who that council is. Because at the moment, we've got a say over one person, but you've got a large number of other people who are making decisions on things that affect us. Yeah.
Fair enough perspective, and hence the choice between wards and at-large, or actually combination. A combination is an option. Yeah.
Yeah, Malcolm, look, I think and these are just sort of, I don't know that they're official views, but I think the Local Government Commission, in terms of what you were saying, Charles, sees a very strong merit in the community board system and that local representation and so on. And I think the indications I've had whenever I've had discussions is that they would, in terms of the community board, take some persuading that in actual fact it would in some way add if they were removed, if you get my drift. And I think the subtext of that is it's not necessarily, I think they see merit in the community boards as providing. And I take that that's different, but it was what Charles was saying around the value of community boards separate from board system.
Within the overall process, there are objection and appeal rights. Okay, so if one of the criteria that councillors will have to keep in the back of their minds is ultimately the decision they reach is capable of appeal, so they need to be sure that the argument they put forward as to why the proposal they're putting forward is the right one can be sustained were it to come to it. So, for example, if you take the at-large argument and they say, yeah, I hit those arguments and we're prepared to run with that, if someone in the community who's adversely affected say, well, actually, I don't agree with that, the ward system was working, then the council would have to know, may have to defend that decision. So that's why they have to give due consideration to it. If they don't feel it stacks up, then that may be the call that they make, and this could be a demographic thing over time, but ultimately that's why the obligation's on them. But I remind councillors that they need to be prepared to defend it before the Local Government Commission, and that's got to be a credible defence, not a flippant or frivolous one.
Just a clarity thing there. So if we went to an at-large system, would community boards be abolished?
Community boards issue is separate, and we can come to that now if you'd like. I'm just conscious of your time. But no, so there's sort of two levels to this whole review, okay? The first one is the nature of representation across the district as a whole from an elected member councillor point of view, who are different to community boards, okay? They have the function and the obligation to discharge their obligations pursuant to the Local Government Act. So that's the first, and that's primarily what we've been talking about now. As I'll just show you in a minute, as well as that, the council and the councillors and the mayor are required to consider the nature of community board well. So it is caught up in the representation review by definition. So, but they're different things. So it's not unheard of for councillors in the past, not here but elsewhere, to have decided to either alter the award system or keep the award system or move away from community boards or increase community boards. Those are different judgments and there are various competing reasons why that might be. Often, primarily locally based because communities are different. So that's, but we're happy to move on to that now. No, we've got a 7 o'clock cut-off time. On the broader representation issue, we've had the debate around at-large and wards. We've had you understand, I hope, the plus or minus 10% rule and what we're grappling with. Are there any other comments on that people might want to make at this time, bearing in mind you will have more opportunity?
So I just had a question. Is there a history of mesh block changes within ward boundaries? Like how far have mesh block boundary changes been made over the last, say, 20 to 30 years?
In Timaru, do you mean? Not
In our region that we're discussing?
I don't have that information. I haven't, my understanding has been made no more that there hasn't been much alteration, but I could be wrong about that. Certainly at the last review, it was basically the same as the previous review, so they just rolled it. It's just that option's not available this time because of demographic change. So I don't know how far that goes back, but ultimately whatever happened had to comply with the 10% rule. So there may well have been, but we're going back into history just because, a bit like financial markets, what happened in the past doesn't necessarily predict what's going to happen.
No, that's true. But I'm looking at this, the information that was there before, and I wonder historically what were also mesh blocks to the side. The numbers in our 10%, so Geraldina's 15% at the moment, historically, has that been growing to that point? Sorry, that is a separate question I'm now asking.
That is a separate question. Don't know the answer to that. I'm guessing probably because of demographic change, yeah.
So, and consequently the other wards are also growing or maybe reducing, but surely that would drive some of our decisions.
There's again, it's snapshot in time, remember, based on the census data before you. My observation of districts is that there are two aspects to growth. There's generally the district as a whole, and then there's within a district. So some areas can grow faster relative to others. It does appear, based on the preliminary information we have, that Geraldine seems to be growing at a rate higher, but as a whole, Timaru could well be growing. But again, my immediate view on that is that's a potential red herring in the sense that we just need to look at the numbers as they are today. Or whenever the census data comes out, and that's the number, irrespective of what has happened in the past or which may happen in the future. But you get the future through the future representation review.
And I accept that view as well, except there are trends. If there's an ongoing long-term trend with no abatement for any other reason, then you could assume it's going to continue.
Yes,
that's what census is doing.
I hear that, and it's certainly you can do trend analysis, but again, councils have to make a decision based on the information in front of them, and if they say, we think it's going to change in 10 years, so let's future-proof and do this, and then someone comes in and says, well, that may be fine and dandy, but those are not the numbers today, and you did not meet your obligation, so that's how they have to think about it. I probably... I would argue to councils that's put more of an issue around long-term planning and economic development in terms of where things are going, and the rep review catches up with that stuff in due course. Yeah.
Related to the figures, so will there be, once the census figures come through and you've got those figures, will all this be recalculated through again?
To calculate ultimately in terms of a final proposal, the one that is taken to the 2025 election. So the way it works is council has to do what is known as an interim proposal, and then that is put, so that's saying this is what we think the nature of representation should be, and then that kicks off a formal consultation process under the Act, I think 8 weeks from top of my mind, I think it is. Then, having taken on board the consultation to the extent that they believe they should, they then have a final proposal, okay? And then that becomes the proposal that will go to, will be the electoral makeup for the 2025 local body election, unless it's appealed and unless the appeal is successful, okay? Now, so a well-run process that stacks up objectively to scrutiny, has properly run a valid and sound consultation process with the community, is likely to stand up. So you'll fall down generally if your process has not been robust. Solar people, I have willfully ignored consultation, that sort of thing, or I've ignored a fact, or I've deliberately ignored one of the rules, like the plus or minus 10% rule, then you're going to come a cropper. So we're doing this very systematically to ensure council's in a good position to take a considered proposal, firstly to its community, and secondly, that can stand pat with the Commission, should it ever come to that. Yeah. Doesn't mean there will be an appeal, there just are appeal rights, and so we need to be aware of it. So under the Act, and there's the section of the Act up there, 19J, a territorial authority must, at the time it's considering the broader aspect of the representation, make a number of decisions around community boards. And so it has to decide whether there should be any or not. It has to decide if it wants community boards, what's the nature of the community to be served by those boards and the structure of that board. The questions are then itemised there under the second main bullet point. We have 3 community boards at the moment, as I understand it, and elected members are going to have to decide whether they, 1, wish to continue with the boards, and 2, if they do, are they happy with the current makeup? There has been discussion at the previous session about maybe we don't need as many appointed members as has been in the past. What is required is that the number of elected community board members must be in the majority. Okay, so appointed community board members from councillors must be under 50%. So, there did not, I think, at least from a preliminary discussion point of view, the sense I took from the meeting anyway, subject to, I think you're the only councillor in the room who was at the discussion, was, Scott, but you weren't at our, we're online, were you? Okay, sorry Stacey, I didn't realise. Was that the number of community, the 3 community boards you have now, there was no pressing need to alter that, as I understood the sense of the meeting. Is that fair comment, councillors? Yep. But really, or for that matter, the number of elected community board members to it, though councillors may want to review who's appointed and who's not. One thing I will, so that's the decision, and we're seeking your feedback. Are you happy with that position? If you have a different point of view. The other aspect just to be aware of is that within a review, we do not consider the nature of the delegations that a community board operates under. So that's outside the scope of the review. It's simply, do we have community boards? If so, how many? What areas do they serve, and how many elected members within the statutory limits that are there? So your community board members, so we're really interested in your point of view.
From my perspective, what you've been told is about right. Yeah. I mean, we keep pretty busy. I think we do a good job. As a community board, we have in the last year submitted on 3 national processes, including doing a select committee hearing. We've submitted on district-wide processes, and we've got the usual potholes and gardens issues too. Yeah.
The feeling of of the community board members? You're happy with the status quo at this stage?
I think, speaking from the Temuka Community Board, that's the representation that we provide to our community is very important. I think because we're in the community all the time, we're an access point for people to come and see us and bring their points of view forward to us in a more informal nature that we can take on further. If you didn't have that representation in your communities, some people would miss out because they wouldn't come into a building like this or a situation that might put them under stress. And so I think it's a necessary part to give that, that overall consultation for the community.
I guess I'll speak on behalf of my non-existent Pleasant Point members, but I'm sure that they would actually agree that the status quo is good. We're actually had a big learning curve this year, and we're reaching out to our wider community in Cave, which was an issue that had been sadly forgotten about for a few years. So I think we're all moving forward with that quite nicely. Thank you.
Other issues that you would argue that councillors need to turn their mind here, other than there's no pressing need to alter the status quo, on at least at the community board level, where the 10% rule doesn't apply, by the way. An easy discussion, yeah. Part of the considerations into the proposal. So just to talk you through how that rolls. So we are now essentially in the pre-consultation phase, and councillors considered whether they want to do more of that or not, and they do have the opportunity to do so because of the timeline that we're working to, and that ultimately be their call. Once they go to initial proposal, and it's a capital I and a capital P for a reason, that's a formal document under the Act. And that is required to be publicly notified, that document. That commences the formal consultation process, where there's a submission process which can be heard and then taken on board. Then, after submissions, the council will then move to the second decision point, which is the final proposal on capital F, capital P. Again, publicly notified, okay? This is what we've decided to do for the purposes of the 2025 local body elections. Now, there are appeal and objection rights. So, and in terms of appeal, any person or organisation, including a community board, okay, that has made submissions on an initial proposal can lodge an appeal. So, in other words, if you haven't given a submission on the initial proposal, you're out of time. So that's a strong incentive to have a point of view, particularly from a community board if you do. Objections, if the council has amended the initial proposal as a result of feedback from the community and the community boards, etc., then there's an objection right that can be put. So appeals and objections are slightly different. The key point to note is ultimately those are determined outside council by the local government. Duffy, who I know relatively well, and he and his colleagues would then go through a hearing process and to make a decision. Now, they are required to do so, if that ever were to happen, no later than the 15th of January to finish that process, and then to make a decision by the 10th of April of 2025. So at the latest, the community will know what the electoral arrangements for 2025 are by April for an October election. Now, in terms of the periods that the council is now working to, so we're in what we call preliminary consultation. So that's between essentially now and the 31st of July 2024. The council must make an initial proposal by that date. And obviously, touch wood, we'll have the final census data by then. They're promising us May. We will approach Stats to see if they can expedite that for Timaru, because it may be that Timaru's relatively straightforward. We just don't know, or they'll probably say, sorry, Malk, you have to wait to everybody else, and it's going to be May, according to their website. Once the 2024 date is set, we're in that proposal, as I said earlier, and then 8 weeks to the final submission, and then 2025. So there's a number of steps. We're in step preliminary, then step 1, then step 2, then possibly appeals and or objections. So a number of bit of work to go yet, depending on how well this lands. Yeah.
So Malcolm, are you saying that submissions from the likes of us and other community members should be made by 20th of December? Is that correct?
No. Sorry, no. Once there's an initial proposal, which council must do by the end of July in the coming year, that's the formal proposal, and then you can make a formal submission which can give you appeal rights. Prior to an initial proposal, council's essentially in a pre-consultation phase, and they may choose to go out further to seek your views. That's a discussion yet to have, and there was a discussion at the workshop with councils about how that might roll. And Councillor Pye made a point earlier about could we do more, and the answer is yes. The key one is that initial decision, and you have to make that in the period between the 20th of December this year and the 31st of July. So they can't actually do an initial proposal till after the 20th of December. Okay. So in other words, you're well in, council is in good shape from a timeline perspective. You don't want to be at the other end where you're pushing things and that leads to errors and so on and so forth.
So if the ward system is agreed to and continue on as it has been, is there, and this is over and above this, is there any consideration for once that information comes in to then go, do we look at community boards and then see how we can better use the asset of a community board to help better in the community?
If I'm understanding your question correctly, my answer would be this. The position and nature of community boards will be part of the initial proposal as required by the representation review. How, and that'll be, let's assume that the discussion we've just had lands in the final proposal, there'll be 3, they're the existing ones and so on and so forth. That's all the proposal will deal with. How you as community boards interact with council is a separate issue for you to discuss. It's outside the representation. The Review is simply concerned with are we providing sufficient mechanisms for the community to be adequately represented. So they are, and on that, your issue, different councils adopt that in different ways. Yeah.
So if we want to be proactive on it, we could write our own letters between now and the 20th of December.
In terms of?
Suggestions to councillors.
Yes. I mean, one of the aspects of community boards is you're obviously elected in your own right. You have a point of view. Other than I make the point that the decision is for councillors, that is their role, yeah. But they obviously will hear views, and as a result, these workshops are live streamed, so arguably the whole community is now live to the issues, or, if they're interested, and no doubt have the ability to also talk to their councillors, their elected representatives if they want to. And ultimately, it's an issue on which many people have many differing views. The role of the councillors is to make the judgment that they feel best meets the needs of the Timaru district, subject to the fair and effective representation of communities of interest. It all makes sense. I know it sounds very complicated, but it is what it is. I'm happy to take any other comment or observations. We've got a little bit of time, 10 minutes or so, if you have any. Otherwise, we can wrap up. Over in your hands, ladies and gents. Councillor's point of view, did I cover everything enough? Yeah, happy? Yep. Point being that I didn't not cover the things I ought to have covered. Yep. Yep. Think about it, and sorry, I keep forgetting to do that. To think about it and feedback as you go, but this isn't the last opportunity to be involved. Okay. Thank you for your time.